All right.
Well, I'm very pleased to be talking to Daniel Solis. Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself? What's your background?
Hello, Nathan. Good to talk to you. I'm Daniel Solis, indeed. My background is I'm Czech-born. I'm Western bred and educated. My background is into political sciences. I've studied in Brussels between 1988 and 1993. Before studying in Brussels, I've lived in Austria, in Vienna, where I ended up in 1982 during communism as a refugee. Me and my mother were more or less forced to leave the country. Well, forced, it was always an individual decision either to stay here or leave and try to make a better life somewhere else without political oppression, without social oppression, for people who did not want to remain living in a totalitarian regime. So I was one of these people who ended up abroad. I was 14 years old when I left Czechoslovakia, and I was 20 years old when I left Austria for Brussels, where I started my studies of political sciences and sociology, and then finished them, and then continued with the postgraduate studies of international and European law at the Free University of Brussels.
And since returning here to Prague, you've made a study of political events in the transition, and what would you like to say about that?
Well, the transition happened during the time I studied in Brussels, because what we refer to as the Velvet Revolution occurred in fall in November 1989, and in 1989 I was in the second grade of university. New opportunities opened for me. That was going back to my former country, which was fantastic after all these years that I couldn't see most of my relatives or see the places that I grew up at. So I went very soon. I went back to Prague. That was in December, 4th of December 1989, and I finished my studies in Brussels, but I was going in between the two countries. I have met the people who were behind the revolution, who were active, the students. I've also made some student exchange programs between my university and some universities here, who were being received in the parliament, in the new parliament. And I was very interested in the new prospects, in the new perspectives, in starting a new life for the whole nation. I was very enthusiastic. I was 22 years old. But sooner or later it showed it was not such a positive development after all.
Really? And why is that?
Well, because we ended up in what we live through right now. I have found a way back to the academic environment a few years ago when I started teaching courses in political sciences at some private university here in Prague. Before that, just to add to my background, I worked also in the Czech Parliament in the lower chamber as an assistant of an MP, Olga Zubová. That is a history on its own, actually, because the MP I worked for was part of the rebels within the Green Party. The rebels because they opposed, among other policies of the leader of the Green Party, Bursik, the construction of a US military base, part of the anti-missile shield of the United States of America. While the Greens had in their charter that they would not support any foreign military bases on the territory of Czech Republic, the new leadership of the Greens that was promoted from people around and ex-President Václav Havel, voted in the government, because they became part of the government, voted for the installation of the US military base, which led to extreme tensions within the Green Party. So these few MPs who were rebels within the Green Party, they have been ejected from it and kicked out, and that actually led to the fall of the government.
Yes.
Of the parliament. That was during the presidency of the Czech Republic in the European Union. So funny occurrence.
So one way or another, you've had access to some fairly high-level people who were directly involved in the Velvet Revolution and the transition period.
Yes, indeed.
And you probably can't name all of the people who've spoken to you, but they had a fairly significant role, is that right?
Yes, they still do, some of them. Some of them are dead, but some of them withdrew from politics, either to be involved in business or not to be bothered with politics because they are disenchanted. But they have one thing in common: they don't want to talk about this particular period, the Velvet Revolution.
And you say that they feel it wouldn't be safe to talk about it.
I know some people who were very, very closely involved in the transition of power, or transfer of power from the communist to democratic forces, if you want, and they do not want to talk about it, not even to their own wives, as they say.
Yes. So there is a secret.
That's what I think.
And what do you think that secret is?
See, let's start with the fact that there is a myth of a Velvet Revolution. And I call it a myth because there's this official version of what happened. You know, students in the streets bringing flower and a candle, being stopped. They divert of the initial planned route of the demonstration. 17th of November 1989. 17th of November is the International Students' Day, because in 1938 I think some students who demonstrated against the Nazi German occupation of Prague have been apprehended and then executed, shot dead.
There is this myth and...
Oh, the myth is that they have been stopped by the police, then they got some serious beating. Yeah. Apparently there was one student dead. Well, now we know there wasn't. It was a rumor. There was actually a secret police stooge or member who played dead, who's been killed by the police. That was a rumor that was spread to mobilize the masses. And actually, already when we compare it with the other color revolutions and the Arab Spring, it's always the same pattern that goes down to the studies of Gene Sharp, of non-violent struggle, etc., etc. So comparing what happened in 1989, what is called the Velvet Revolution, with the other US orchestrated color revolutions, orchestrated and financed by USAID or National Endowment for Democracy, etc. This is a perfect match. People who were the student leaders or who were part of the dissidents, they have actually been awarded by the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED. They got an award. I'm referring, I can name him because it's on his own web page and in his own CV, this information, as well as the fact that he had an internship with the German Marshall Fund of the US, which is another very dubious organization in my terms. Some authors and journalists relate this organization to the Fluchtkapital, by the way. I'm referring to Paul Manning, the former CBS journalist.
So,
and Alex Constantine, the US investigative journalist. And that's Alexander Vondra, our former Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, who is now candidate to be ambassador of the Czech Republic in Israel. but the president would not name him. But the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Prince Schwarzenberg, who's a Bilderberg and Trilateral Commission member, wants him to be there. But I'm drifting away from the topic here, please remind me.
So, although the events of the Velvet Revolution were presented as being a spontaneous uprising, they were actually not spontaneous.
Orchestrated. Orchestrated. I have described it as a color revolution that is matching with this typical scenario of a color revolution. There's a nice documentary called The Revolution Business. It's a 20 minutes documentary by Journeyman Project that describes a Serb group that is now giving advice and is instructing the government opponents in various countries how to make a color revolution, a non-violent struggle. For example, they were operating with these Arab Spring dissidents.
The interesting point here is, so who orchestrated this? Was this orchestrated by outside forces, or was it perhaps orchestrated with the cooperation of the previous communist government?
That's a good question. I would say yes, it was both. Because the communist government only could obey orders from outside, and that is from the Soviet Union. They could not have staged this on their own. They could have not negotiated this with other countries' secret services, notably the CIA, on their own. So apparently, from the information that there were negotiations between the CIA and the KGB about these things that some Czech politicians, communist politicians, have been also part of. There are books published on this subject, and there is some mention of this in them. Especially.
Can you name one of those books, just for interest?
I think it's called The Man Behind the Table, and if I translate it correctly, it's a book by an ex-aide of the ex-Minister of Foreign Affairs, Strobel. I think his name was Sedlacek, if I'm not mistaken. And he says, yes, there have been negotiations I have witnessed personally between the KGB and CIA as the aide of former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Strobel.
Now, this will be quite a shock to most people in the West. And one of the questions that they would ask is, well, why on earth would the communists want to negotiate the apparent downfall of their own regimes?
Right. Well, I can't hardly talk about what was the motive of this in the Soviet Union. You remember words like perestroika and glasnost, and Gorbachev, who was behind those words. That was a plan that was quite long-standing. There's another interesting book that I came across first at the University Library in Brussels. It's called The Cold Comes from Kremlin by Vladimir Mlynář, a politologist in Innsbruck. He was also a refugee to Austria. I think he left in 1968 during the Prague Spring and continued his career in Austria. And he was a roommate during his studies in Moscow of Gorbachev. And he reported of the plans that they had to make the socialism a viable system that would be acceptable for people and that would actually make their lives better, as in contrary to the totalitarian regime that was in these Eastern European countries then. So it's a plan that had some history. I don't know what was the reason for Gorbachev to end the Cold War, but I think it might have been some economical reasons. Remember, economic reasons. Remember that the war in Afghanistan was draining the Soviet Union, and I remember I was at the NATO headquarters in Brussels with the students from my university that were interested in political affairs, and the NATO people received the group of students and showed us graphs of how fast the Soviet economy is declining, and that they are being at the verge of being broke financially, and that they will collapse. That was a prediction that was probably in end of 1988 or beginning of 1989. But the reason that this takeover would happen in the Czech Republic was an easy explanation would be people were greedy, was greed. During the collectivist regime, people could not steal much money because it would show. You could not have a better car than anybody else. How would you get it when it was a collective regime or the centrally planned economics? And of course there were some jobs that could make you earn more money. That was like working in the mines or being in the police or having really hard jobs, whatever. Yeah, being maybe a sailor or something like that. But usually the people had the same wage, and if you managed to get more money because you were a thief or not honest, or you just diverted the money, you could not use it because it would immediately show and you'd be arrested. And even if you would be able to show it, where would you get these luxury goods? Like better cars or better clothes? Some people were supported by their relatives from the West, sending money or even these better clothes. So there was to a certain extent, some people were better off, and they had links to the West. But if you had links to the West, you could not be part of the political establishment, or military, or security, or whatever. So these people thought like, darn, we are better, we are the elite, but we can't take advantage of it. So the young communists, they thought like, wouldn't there be a way we would break out of this pattern and could enjoy the fact that we're the elites? So they were driven by greed, I think, because no real communist would open up to the West the way this country opened to the West and became a prey for the imperialist practices, where the whole industry has been totally destroyed, undermined, and nothing has been left over. Everything has been bought out and devastated.
So you're outlining a scenario where the motive was corruption, that people could actually benefit from ill-gotten spoils.
Maybe I am wrong, but this is my impression, because this is exactly what happened right after the revolution. Mm-hmm. While the people on the street have been given sex and drugs and rock and roll, to make an example. And I remember there were a lot of drugs at that time. A lot of people who were decent and were artists got hooked on heroin. It was like a disease.
Just after the Velvet Revolution?
Yes, that was one of the first things that came, was heroin.
So this must have had a profound effect on culture.
Oh yes, it had. The culture that played before the revolution an important role and was actually used as a spearhead for the revolution, probably declined and lost its importance. People were dancing on the streets. There was a lot of freedom for the common man that has never been experienced before. There was a huge influx of American youth and students who taught English. There were like 30,000 Americans just in Prague to give courses in English. That was another phenomenon in the early 90s. Then places were opening with like hard rock cafes and nightclubs and house party clubs, and there was a lot of partying. A lot of people were interested to see this country, Eastern European country. There used to be lots of young people traveled every summer to Prague and partied. It was fantastic for young. I was 22, 23. I had a great time here, obviously, and I did not realize then what was happening, because while all this was going on, in the meantime, the elites were transferring the wealth of the nation to their private pockets and pipelining it outside abroad. So this country had no debts before the revolution. There was a tremendous surplus on in the balance sheet. I think it was a few million crowns per capita. And now we have huge debts. We've got 100,000 crowns debts per capita now. So because the communists were not such bad managers, as it seems now, as was told, that this economy is not viable, etc. No, the economy was perfect. We had a very strong industrial basis and academic research, the fundamental research and innovations, patents. It was a sound society, with one exception. It was an oppressed society. Obviously, it lacked liberties, civil liberties, to a certain extent. Now, when we look at what's happening now, I think it's the same thing, but people are giving up their liberties voluntarily. They're trading them for luxuries and goods and stuff like that, material values. While there, it was not their own choice. That's the only difference. It's been imposed on them, while now they give it up voluntarily by themselves, without even knowing what they're doing. Maybe signing into mortgages and then becoming slaves to their mortgage, and then when they fail to pay, they're being taken away these things, and they're foolish to believe that everything is fine when it's not, etc. But it's their own will. That's the tricky part. Well, there, during the communism, was not their own will. They were meant to do that, and if they didn't, they had problems. They couldn't advance in their schooling or education. They were told what to do, and they could end up in prison. Indeed, I'm not painting the regime, the former regime, pink. I'm just saying they were good managers. They kept their finances together, and their industrial base was great. Well, it cannot be said about the present situation in this country. So, to come back to your question, you said what would be the driving motive? I said it could be greed, or to some extent it could be idealism. Somebody could convince the people, the communists, the young communists, and appeal on their idealism. Let's make it even a better place. Now we have everything set up, and we can open the economy. We will stop the Cold War, etc., etc. You could, I wasn't there, but I can imagine that there was not only greed. What happened after the Iron Curtain fell? There's a grand theft started, and it's unbelievable that so many years after the Velvet Revolution, when this grand theft started, there is still things to be stolen. It is it testifies how rich this country used to be. Yeah, it's 23 years ago, and it's been still stolen. The public goods, the properties. There's still things that can be stolen. The airport is still there, and the railways are still there, etc., etc. And obviously the politicians are after them still, but it's becoming less and less obvious. So we have these two factors, to come back to our topic. We have the external factors, which comprises the secret service of both superpowers, USA and the Soviet Union. They decide that there will be a change, transfer of wealth under certain conditions. And these conditions have not been met in the end because, for example, one of the conditions was that NATO will not enter the sphere of the Soviet bloc, which NATO did in the end, and it keeps doing it now, trying to lure into their fascist structures Ukraine and Georgia, etc., and the ex-Soviet republics that have been referred to as Commonwealth of Independent States. So obviously, but let's go back to when it started. So there were promises being made that have never been fulfilled and kept. Obviously, we're not surprised. But under these circumstances, there was some kind of a negotiations that which led to this compromise that turned out to be not such a compromise, but went to become an absolute takeover of power. Because the communists involved here, they were meant to take part in the new government, and that's what happened. And they withdrew gradually. They took control privately then of, for example, the petrochemical industry of the Czech Republic and of a lot of big industries when this process called privatization took place. Obviously, the communists from the communist regime were the first to privatize the properties.
So some of them took positions in these new companies and benefited by control or ownership.
Yes, I think they did, but they very quickly withdrew even from that. They sold them either to foreign investors, or they established maybe foreign companies and transferred the property to them so they would become invisible. And obviously some of the people who were in the new politics, like the former president Václav Klaus, who was directly involved in the transfer of property, of the public property to become a private property. He benefited to a certain extent, but he must have done so through other people and other companies, because he remained in the politics until recently. It's only this year that he finished his office, his presidential office.
Now, you had an amusing story about what might have happened if the Velvet Revolution hadn't happened. A story about China.
Oh, that story I told you. It's not my story. I told you that I know a lot of people that I would like to keep disclosed. That I would not like to disclose now at this point. But they were they're a bit older than I. So during the Velvet Revolution, they were in the bright age, and they were the dissidents, as we call them. We're now actually here at the jazz section, which in their premises in Prague, which is one of the very important dissident groups in the jazz section. They were musicians and literary artists, and they fought against the communist regime. And it's paradoxical that we sit here and we talk about the fact that the Velvet Revolution was staged, and that a lot of people have been misled, and then a lot of people who took part in the revolution were actually agents, prepared for this task many years before it happened.
Now, this is an interesting thing, because if you say that there were agents and that they were placed before the revolution, how long in advance were these? What sort of people were these, and how were they placed, and how did you know that they were, or suspect that they were agents?
Must have been a whole generation of people prepared for this task, because they should have had no connections to the former regime. So there were two sorts of, there were leaders who have been identified as such by the secret police, who were recruited to take part in this. Then there were the children of these dissidents from 1968. I mentioned, for example, Mr. Deanspear. I think I can speak about him because he was a good man, and he's dead now. And his son is still in the politics, and he plays an important role in the Czech politics. His son ran for president this year during the elections. He ended in the second round. He didn't make it to the first round. But his father was a dissident. He was a Communist Party member, and that's a typical profile of all these people. They were Communist Party members. Then they were dismissed from the Communist Party for all sorts of reasons. Or they left the Communist Party in 1968 after the invasion of the Warsaw Treaty. Military units who were called to pacify the attempt in 1968 of, as they called it, the counter-revolution under Dubček, this revival movement, let's make a socialism with a human face. So it was the Prague Spring. People probably remember that under that name, Prague Spring. They like to coin these events, like Velvet Revolution, Prague Spring, and whatever, Saffron Revolution, the Green Revolution, and the Arab Spring. It's all interrelated. It's not a coincidence. But Prague Spring 1968, so for example, Deanspear, he was during that time in Washington as a Czech radio correspondent. His son was born there in 1968. Now he ran for president here. And during the Velvet Revolution, his son and other people, obviously also children of some former communist people, they were the student leaders, the people behind this protest march, the demonstration that ended up in the police beating up these protesters, these students, carrying a candle and a flower already then. And a thing you have seen in the manuscript for the Egyptian Arab Spring. And to cut the long story short, they then organized the students and the activities that followed after this incident that led actually to the seizure of the Communist Party from the power. But the Communist Party was anticipating this. It was all under their coordination. Not everybody knew this, but the key persons within the Communist Party, the progressive wing that was struggling against the conservative wing within the Czech Communist Party, they knew this and they were preparing it and they were controlling it from the beginning until the end. The documents that are available and the testimonies point to that. And as far as these agents are concerned, well, if you look through the archives from the secret police that are still intact and available, you see that there were 2 waves of purges of these files before the revolution. I'm not sure, I'm not a historian, when exactly that happened, but I would guess one was around 1984 and the other was shortly before the revolution. That means in early 1989, where a lot of files have been destroyed on certain people. So there were 2 sorts of people. People who had their files complete and they never achieved anything and they were persecuted later and denounced as collaborants and secret police, whatever, members. And there were other people who are now holding prominent positions still within the society, science, culture, government, politics, what you want. Their files are either non-existent or there are files, but they are very meager. And from the list of files, you see lacunes. Many files are missing. They are listed, but they're not there.
So let's just recap. There are 2 things here. That people were placed within the dissident ranks who were really agents of the communist regime. Okay. And they were placed there many years in advance, perhaps a generation in advance. and that their files were removed, in some cases 5 years before the Velvet Revolution, and that these people have been protected and advanced subsequently.
Yeah, it was like controlled opposition.
Controlled opposition.
Some of these people, like President Václav Havel, was even in prison, but from the people who were in prison with him, I know that he had always been a favorite prisoner. He never had to work, he could just write his letters, his books, etc. While the other political prisoners had to do much harder work.
And some of them had a really hard time.
Yes. This is only from what I hear from other people. I wasn't there, so I cannot testify on this, but I know a lot of political prisoners from then. Some are my friends. I know people who were not prisoners but who were part of this, for example, the jazz section or the Charter 77 declaration. There was a group around people like Patočka that were using the final act of Helsinki Conference from 75 as a starting point for the criticism of their the government. They said, well, the government signed some principles in Helsinki during the conference that are codified in the final act, and the government is breaching them. So on that, we are a group of people who will criticize this and who will criticize the government and who will speak to foreign governments and ask them for sanctions.
So these real activists, what happened to them?
Well, there were two sorts of activists, the controlled activists and the real activists, because there must have been a mass movement around that for it to survive and have a chance to reach the goals and the objectives. So there were these blind activists who didn't know that they were part of a controlled opposition, and then there was this elite, small number of activists. They knew very well what's happening and they felt privileged because they had an easy life. The current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Prince Schwarzenberg, was in touch with these people. He was based in Austria and had managed funds provided by the same organization as always. They were meant to support the political prisoners and their families here. And from what I hear, he came to Prague, he was handing over the money to these managers of the dissent. He never got actually bothered by the secret police, never got arrested, never got touched. He was telling me that at the Czech embassy in Vienna that we were occupying in December 1989 with him and other people as activists who tried to join in the revolution, help from outside. I was very happy that there was a revolution going on, but I didn't know the background then. I was 22 years old. So Prince Schwarzenberg said, like, yeah, the secret police, they were everywhere. They were arresting people, but they haven't even looked at me as if I was a man of glass. He said, men of glass, transparent, invisible. That was the story from then. But what happened to the money? There are actually stories that the money never got to the real people in trouble, the political prisoners and their families, but have been distributed between the elite dissidents, and they're used for big parties against sex and drugs and rock and roll. I could even believe that, because the political prisoners who I know said, yeah, they never got any money. And they were very disenchanted to later have found out that there was money provided for them. And they never had them, and they really had a hardship to live through. So even within this movement there was an elite. And this elite was cultivated by the communists. The communists needed this controlled opposition in order to achieve the transfer of public into private property.
So this was planned in advance?
In my opinion, and from what I hear, and I think this opinion is substantiated, yes. And to come back to the story about China, I think it's about time to tell you the story again. One of these people who was a dissident, who actually actively supported the revolution, coordinated the demonstrations, and who signed the Charter 77 declaration I mentioned, and part of this organization called Charta 77 here in the Czech Republic, later became involved in some security structures of this country. In the 90s, he actually had to choose between the former Secret Service people who will remain and who will go. Yeah, choose those who were not harming people and did it as their job and tried to remain decent. Existed also that part. We don't talk about it because we like to talk about the street because it was nasty and abusing and torturing. Sure, you find these people too, but it's not all of them. Some were bad, some were good, as always. So this guy was involved pretty much, and recently he visited China for some reason, for business purposes, and it was the first time in his life he went to China. And he came back and he said, Daniel, oh my God, so if this is what we were fighting against, then I was wrong the whole time. If this is the communism that they were trying to install here, and we thwarted that, then I was wrong. Because China, clean, friendly, advanced, brilliant infrastructure, nothing to compare with what we live here. Everybody smiling on the street, being polite, trying to talk, you know, very kind, nothing overcrowded, nothing dirty, no oppression whatsoever. And he visited a few places, few cities, and he traveled with people. He lived there. He actually did an internship in some company, and he was totally surprised. He's like, "Oh my God, we did the wrong thing. We have brought something to fall that could have flourished into what is now China, and we have stopped it, and we've opened the gates of hell. We opened the door to theft, to devastation of our economy and of our morals, because we have maybe increased the level of human rights, but we cannot exercise them because we can't afford them. And there is a different totality now. It's a totality of money, totality of slavehood. What's the word?
Wage slaves.
Right. So there is a slavery, I was going to say. Not that we are slaves of an oppressive regime, but we are slaves of a capitalist system that will not give us any freedom of movement, only to work and get the money and give the money up and then try to make the ends meet. So the people who fought for freedom have now become slaves again, but not slaves to a regime, but slaves to a system.
And slaves to mortgages and to debts that are forced to take on, for example, to pay for an education.
And slaves to usury.
Yes.
Usuries.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Exactly. And that's the system. It's the financial system, the banksters system, and the corrupt politicians system. You know, the politicians during the communism were corrupt to an idea, to a corrupt idea. And now the new politicians now seems they are corrupt to money and to also a corrupt idea, and that's a corrupt idea of capitalism. So we have not gained much. I guess we've lost more than we've gained from what it seems and these older people say. I'm young, so I haven't really lived through the communism. I lived here until I was 14, and then I left it. And when I came back, it was over. But what I see here doesn't really look like a liberty.
One of the comments that I've frequently heard is that under communism, there was only a single way to think. You know, that there was a single ideology, there was a single right way, and that other views were not acceptable. Do you think we've moved on from that, or is that still where society is now?
It's a tricky question, Nathan, because I think people could have their inner world during the communism. Some people liked the cowboys and Indians stories. Some people could dedicate their free time, and there was a lot of free time, to their hobbies, be it astronomy or botany or whatever. And they could exercise their interest, and they could have a different opinion. Most of the people differed in their opinion to the communist ideology, but they knew they could not speak out loudly about it, so they could speak and whisper about it. And many of them realized that the communists were right in many respects about the fact that imperialism brings wars, and that imperialism exploits people. Yeah. For people in the communist regime, that was a lie, a communist lie. But now that when the communism was over and they saw it with their proper eyes, they thought, they were right. It was not a lie. But everything that the communists said was considered a lie then. And if we have moved away from that, I think not, because we also live in a lie. And if you have a different opinion, you can lose very easily a job. We see what happened in the US after September 11th. There are people who doubt the official story, the truthers, so they call themselves. And from what I hear and read, apparently these people are being persecuted. Only because they have a different idea. You know, it's unpatriotic or whatever, but it's a reason to lose their job, be harassed, and some people who write books about it actually are found dead. Thinking of Philip Marshall, for example. It's a very unfortunate story, and I would like to pay tribute to this man, because I don't believe he killed his 2 children and his dog and then shot himself with the right hand in the left temple. Right, as Wayne Madsen concludes when he investigated this murder, etc., etc. So no, we haven't moved away from it because perhaps during the Cold War, the only weapon West had against the Eastern European establishment was, we are the zone of freedom and liberties. But when the Cold War was over, they no longer needed this argument, so they stopped being the zone of liberty and freedom, and they imposed this totalitarian regime that we are experiencing now more and more. Because to impose it, it's a matter of years. You cannot impose it from one day to another unless you call it a martial law. But this sneaky imposition of oppression, control, and totalitarian regime is happening, and is happening from what I hear from you and other people in the West, as much as it is happening here. But here it takes more time because everything is in disarray and people are extremely sensitive to anything impeding their liberties and freedoms. But the economic oppression helps those measures of control and totalitarian regime being imposed upon them. To survive, people give up their liberties voluntarily. When you start having a problem to make the ends meet, pay your rent, pay your mortgage, pay your food, pay your schools, etc., then you go like, okay, well, give me more money, take my liberties and give me more money.
Yes, I know I'm supposed to intervene you, but the example in the West would be indentured labour. That in England, until the late 1870s, there was indentured labour in the coal mines, and that workers were forced to sell themselves into slavery for 25 years, and if they didn't, they starved. And it's a very similar situation that we seem to be developing towards, where people are forced to take obligations. Well, this is probably a good time to break, but Daniel, thank you very much indeed, and thank you. You indicated that you've probably got more to say in a future interview.
Yes, Nathan, you told me that this is a very new subject for the Western viewers, and they don't know much about this, so it will be already shocking enough to confront them with the hypothesis that the revolution, the fall of Iron Curtain, has been premeditated and and orchestrated from within also. So yes, that's my opinion, and I would like to elaborate on it in a greater detail in the future if you and your listeners and viewers will be interested.
And we look forward to people's questions, and we will try to answer any specific questions.
All right, it will be my pleasure then. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your interview.
Thanks.
Bye.